first four questions come from the League of Women Voters, and the first one is directed to Congressman Murphy. 3 minutes, of course, to respond. Mr. Caligiuri will have 2 minutes to respond to that. Anyway, Mr. Murphy, how would you balance the continuing costs of military actions and the costs of domestic needs?
Well, you start with only fighting wars of necessity, not wars of choice. And in my opinion, the war in Iraq was not a war of necessity. It was a war of choice. That is a critical difference between Senator Caligiuri and I. But moving forward, we have to have a recognition that there are some wars that are worth fighting. And it is the sacred responsibility of any member of Congress to first and foremost do everything necessary to defend this country. And so I did support the war in Afghanistan, and I have supported the President's direction there, because there is a reason to fight a war in the place from which the terrorists who attacked this country trained and planned. But moving forward, we also have to recognize that the cost of fighting these engagements is not just the cost of the troops and the equipment and the armor on the ground, but the cost of these wars entails taking care of every veteran that returns from those wars to American soil, and their families as well. That's a trust that we violated in this country for a long time. And of all the things that I'm proud of over the last 4 years, I'm proud that we have invested record amounts of increased funding into the VA, that we have pre-funded the entire VA a year ahead of time. I'm proud to stand here today as the candidate in this race that has been endorsed by the VFW PAC of this nation. And moving forward, we have to make sure that not only do we give our troops everything that they need to succeed on the ground in the wars that are of necessary action for this nation, but that we make sure that we take care of them when they come back. Lastly, we need to understand that fighting wars and engaging in foreign operations is not the only way that you protect this country. That right now, so long as we continue to run this country based on oil, so long as we continue to send money effectively to the very organizations and influences that are plotting against us, we're making this country less safe. Domestic energy security is about national security for this nation. We have to start paying attention to the things that we do here that influence people's opinions of our country around the globe. The reason why we should care about civil rights and individual rights is not just because it makes sense for our own citizenry, but it changes people's minds about how people view the United States abroad. I believe that we need to fight when we need to fight. The Iraq War was a mistake for this country. The war in Afghanistan was a war of necessity. We need to make sure that we give everything necessary to our troops when they're in the field of battle and protect them and support them when they come home. And then recognize that beyond our military engagements, that there are a myriad of other strategies that we can pursue to keep this nation safe.
2 minutes, Mr. Caligiuri.
Thank you, Tom. The question was, how do you balance the cost of ongoing military action with the need to fund very important domestic programs? And that's a vitally important question that we have to answer for ourselves as a country. And I think the way to answer it is to go back to first principles, and here's what I mean by that. What are the core functions of the federal government? And in my judgment, if there is not but one core function of the federal government, it's to make sure that we protect the national defense, which means having the strongest, best-funded military in the world. And once we engage in military action, we make sure that we do anything and everything we have to do to make sure we accomplish the mission and ensure that the loss of life was worth it because we didn't send those men and women there in vain. And so when I, as a member of Congress, will have to judge between spending for military action, spending on the domestic side, I will always remember that the core first function of the federal government is to protect our national defense, which means protecting our military and our troops. When we go somewhere, we have to fund it to the fullest extent necessary to finish the mission, which is why we have to be so careful about where we intervene militarily in the first place. Because once we do, we have to finish what we started. That will always be my top priority, which is why we have to be so careful about it. And then we have to arrange our other funding priorities in accordance with that first central core function of the federal government.
Second question now goes to Mr. Caligiuri, 3 minutes. What are the respective roles of government and business in maintaining and expanding our state's and the nation's infrastructure? And how do you rank telecommunications in our national infrastructure?
A very important question, and it speaks to the very critical link and symbiotic relationship between the government and the private sector when it comes to the issue of building out, maintaining, and expanding our national infrastructure. I just spoke a moment ago about core functions of the federal government, the first being protecting our national defense. The second, in my judgment, is making sure that we always do everything we can from a federal perspective to preserve, maintain, and build out our national infrastructure. It's well known that our national highway system is the product of federal policy. It is an obligation of the federal government, in cooperation with the states, to make sure that we always fund the programs that we need to keep our infrastructure intact. It was done originally for purposes of protecting our national defense. But today, it's an absolutely vital part of creating economic strength and vitality throughout this country, but especially in this region. So, first and foremost, we need to pass a transportation bill that's comprehensive, long-term, and allows for us to have a long-term capital improvement plan when it comes to our national infrastructure. I believe that telecommunications should be a part of that broader infrastructure improvement plan. So it's transportation not just in the physical sense, but in the sense of information and technology. They should go together more than ever before. The way the private sector comes in is that it's the private sector that ends up being the entities that go out there and do the work that we need to do to carry out the mandate that the government has to ensure that we have a robust, well-established, well-maintained, and expanded infrastructure. Right now, we have 30% unemployment among the building trades. The best way to get that down is to have a fully funded, well-planned out transportation bill that creates long-term prosperity for the trades and helps our national infrastructure in the process. So that's how I see the federal government, in partnership with the states and the business sector, working together. The one hand setting policy and funding, the other hand implementing what we need to do to make sure we always preserve our infrastructure. And today, in the 21st century, that has to include telecommunications.
2 minutes for Mr. Murphy.
There was a report that came out about 10 years ago on the economic potential and future of Connecticut. And that report made the rounds both in the state legislative branch and also the executive branch. And what it warned us was that Connecticut was at risk of becoming what it called an economic cul-de-sac. That we were so perfectly poised for economic growth here because of our proximity to the major international economic and export hubs, in particular Boston and New York. But because it was getting increasingly difficult to move both goods and people through that corridor, businesses were not moving more than 50 miles outside of those main economic areas. For this district, the 5th District, which lies about 50 miles in its corner from New York and farther from Boston, the transportation links into the state are vital for our growth. Now, Connecticut receives about $1.6 back to the state for every dollar it sends with regard to transportation. And just this week, we were able to announce a historic new investment in the state's rail infrastructure, $160 million, which will be coming from the federal government to build a commuter high-speed rail line from Springfield to New Haven. Those are incredibly important projects, not just for the people that need some ease in access of transportation, but for our economy in general. Now, with respect to telecommunications, we have had a massive expansion of telecommunications reach based on investments by the private sector. And there are some who would ask Congress to change in a rather draconian way the regulations that sit on top of private telecommunications companies. I think the federal government can fill in the gaps of private investment, but we have benefited over the last 20 years from private companies doing a pretty good job of investing in telecommunications and broadband, and that should remain the center of our policy.